Hey, how do you feel about some high rarity cards, or maybe some foreign ones, or maybe be ahead of the game with others by preparing for future set releases with very quick shipping? Check out EJ Gaming and use code British5 on checkout for 5% off on all your orders. Link in the description.
Greetings duelists and welcome to another video. Previously this week we have spoke about themes that have been debuted in our next TCG main booster set, Age of Overlord. We already spoke about the Horus archetype and like a lot of plethora of things that they can do. We also talked about the Sinful Spoils alongside the Snake Eyes. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about a theme that has been already been supported in the past. This theme is a fan favorite and has existed for over a decade now, and that one is Tech Genes. Tech Genes, or TG for short, is an archetype that debuted in the year 2011. It is a synchro-centric strategy that was shown in the 5Ds anime, and it introduced something called the Accel synchro mechanic. This mechanic, basically what it means is the ability to use synchro monsters to climb into other synchro monsters. Today in the TCG at this era is pretty much the equivalent of like how you do link climbing with Cyber's decks. Or we already have another dedicated synchro strategy that kind of does that as well, which is the Vanadium deck. I will be covering that in another video. But yeah, my goal today is explain the history of TG, explain the category of cards that are separated in the archetype, and give you a little brief history of how this deck performed in the past, because TG does have a long run history and it has evolved a lot over the years up until now with the new support coming in Age of Overlord. But yeah, without further ado, let's begin. Basically, TG are devised on different categories. You have the tuners, the non-tuners, the tuner synchros, and the non-tuner synchros. Most of the original synchro monsters, or like the original main deck monsters, are pretty much extenders that are predicated on being summoned if you already summoned the monster, or you're summoning a TG, or just a starter that can just summon another TG. And basically, like, the groundwork is that you want to keep summoning them and you want to keep synchro climbing with them. The older TG monsters, which are like TG Striker, Werewolf, the Rhino, just to name like the main three, they all have a floating effect. If they're destroyed, you can add another TG monster back to your hand. That specific effect is going to play a very significant role after I explain like history of the deck even further. Adding to that, you also have a few TG spell and traps. The older TG spells are called the TGX1, the TGX series. While the newer spells, which are the ones that are arriving in Age of Overlord, are just TG like per name. It's kind of strange that they left out the TGX name. I would have preferred if the newer support just had the ability for you to grab TGX cards. And that way you had the functionality for both new and old spell cards in the archetype. However, I'll digress. I will get to these cards once we get to like explaining the evolution of this archetype. But yeah, I won't go super in depth with a lot of them. Like, I'll do that after I show like the decks. Now you have like the Link monster and you have a bunch of synchros. Essentially, when this card was made, we were around the Link era. We were in Master Rule 4, and synchro summoning was very limited back then. So Konami pretty much had to make a card that essentially made the synchro mechanic work even under those grievances. And that was the reason why this card was made. I will get to the explanation of this card and its role later on. And then you have like the super huge Accel Synchros. You have like the TG Halberd Cannon. You have the newer one, which is the Glaive Blaster. I forgot to put it in here. You have the Shooting Star Dragon TGX. So in the anime, the arch nemesis of the Tech Genesis monsters was the Stardust monsters that were played by Jusei, and the Shooting Star Dragon was one of them. That's like one of the explanations why this card exists. But yeah, now that you see a little bit of the cards like as a whole, again, I'm not going to go super in depth with explanations which each card in the archetype, because not every card here is playable, or at least it didn't see playability as of late. I'll do that when I cover the decks. So let's start with this. So TGs debuted on 2011. They debuted on the TCG booster set Extreme Victories, and on that set was also the exclusive TCG release of Reborn Tengu. So with the existence of Reborn Tengu and the ability that all these cards had that involved the graveyard, TG was not being played as Konami kind of wanted it to be played. It wasn't a super dedicated heavy synchro strategy. Instead, it was played as a stun deck. The main reason for that is because two of the TG monsters that had floating effects are both a beast and a beast warrior, meaning that they had synergy with cards like Horn of the Phantom Beast, Skill Drain, and they also had a really cool trap card that essentially worked for them, which is the TG1 EM1. So yeah, back then, the way you would play this deck is as a beatdown deck. You pretty much just try to out-resource your opponent with your trap cards. This is something we've seen in the past with other strategies like Eldritch, Altergeist, just to name like a few examples. But back then, the game was a lot slower. The games didn't last less than 5 turns. So it was super easy to play a deck like this one without super getting punished like by a super heavy combo deck on the first few turns. You'll see here in the extra deck you had a plethora of synchro monsters. A really neat one was Naturia Barkion, because you did play Earths in the name of TG Rush Rhino and Striker. You had the TG Wonder Magician that could synchro on your opponent's turn, but again it was basically here as removal, and it also was here because it had a floating effect. You had Trishula and Stardust because of Starlight Road. Back then, Heavy Storm was legal, meaning that you needed a card to protect your back row back then, because not right now we this card is kind of power crept. We have other forms of removal that are just very harder to stop, like Evenly Mashed. Back then we didn't have stuff like Evenly Mashed. Back then this card was way more powerful. But yeah, Sudden Warning and Sudden Strike were very popular cards at the time. Mirror Force was also a very popular card. But yeah, this was pretty much TG's back then. It was at the start of the XYZ era. XYZ monsters were not really like super like known, or we didn't have enough of them back in the day. So like not so you can see there's a limited amount of XYZ monsters. We also didn't have we did have fusions, but fusions were not like a super heavy popular strategy back then. But yeah, this is what happened to TG, and it did win a couple of events, and it did top a couple of events as well. So back then, this was a super respectable deck. Shoutouts to YGO History. I will leave the video on the description. He talks way more in depth about this deck and its history and how it was played back then. So feel free to check him out. So this is TG. Back then. Now let's see what happened a lot later. So in 2019 we received a set called Savage Strike. and that set pretty much gave us a new wave of TG monsters. And essentially what Konami did is they gave us a plethora of different extenders. The Booster Raptor and the Drillfish had the ability to be special summoned from the hand. Same thing with the Gear Zombie. The Screw Serpent was essentially like a debris dragon. It could bring back like a monster from the graveyard. TG Striker was still being played, same thing as Werewolf, because they were just extenders. They can just be summoned for free. So TG Tank Drop, this was another new card. Essentially this card was a tuner that also was treated as a non-tuner. And it can also spawn a token. So like if you were playing a dedicated Synchro deck, this card was like very played. Right here with other cards, you see cards that just tutor into the other TG cards, like Miscellaneous Saurus was here because it can get you to the Booster Raptor. The Fire Formation Tenki was here to grab us the Werewolf. The Fossil Dig, it was another tutor for the Booster Raptor. Where Arvda was really pivotal in this strategy because you did play a bunch of level 1s. So whatever level 1 that you were missing, you were just grab it with this card. Rhoda because the TG Striker was a warrior. 1-for-1, self-explanatory. Reborn and Succession are just more extenders. So back on 2019, we were still in Master Rule 4. And it was super link based. Synchros had a really hard time doing their plays properly without link monsters, and that's where this card comes in. So essentially the Trident Launcher had the ability to just super extend, hyper summon like a bunch of monsters like from your hand, graveyard, or your deck. And the way you would make this possible was with Crystron Hulky Fibrax. Back in the OCG, this card was on 2019. If for us, we had it on 2020, literally around when Master Rule 5 arrived. But it didn't mean that this deck was unplayable. Actually, it was quite the opposite. It pretty much just made it a lot more aggressive and easier to do plays with. The Savage Strike also introduced us with the Star Guardian, which is essentially another extender. It can grab a TG from your hand, and it can also special summon one from the hand. You had the Reciprocal Dragonfly, which can like desynchro monsters back on the board. And you also had stuff like the Cosmic Blazar Dragon, which was just another boss monster, because back then we didn't have anything that locked you into TGs outside of the Trident Launcher. So yeah, essentially like in a span of 8 years, we went from a super heavy stun deck to just like a super turbo synchro centric strategy, similar to what we see with Vanadium. So now let's talk about Age of Overlord. So essentially what happened with Age of Overlord is we gotten a few more new cards. The first one here will be the Rocket Salamander. This is like the most important card in the deck now, because this essentially is a special summon a TG from the deck. And not only that, but it's another extender if you control machine TG monsters, which before this new support we didn't have that many of them. The only machine TG monsters was the high level synchros. So this aspect would have been like a lot harder to do. However, we did get another new card, and it's called the TG All Clear. All Clear, pretty much what it does, it turns all the TG monsters into machines. That's a very big deal, because not only does it mean more extension with the Rocket Salamander, it means that this other card right here, the Break Limiter, also has another effect, and it can be essentially be played as another extension. You noticed on this list, there's no longer TG Striker and there's no longer TG Werewolf. Those cards are not needed anymore. Basically, the way you're going to be synchro climbing with this deck is mainly with the level 1s and the level 4s. Another thing that you're noticing here is you'll see the Sinful Spoils package. I already did a video on this. Feel free to check it out if you haven't. Well, basically, this also is another new engine or a new archetype that is being debuted in Age of Overlord, and it pretty much bolsters any strategies that have level 1 fire monsters, Rocket Salamander being like the main one of them. Over here, like, you're going to see that we have a bunch of different synchros. One of the main synchros that we have here is the Overdragner. Overdragner pretty much is like the best synchro in the extra deck. Essentially, what it does is when it's synchro summoned, you can bring back as many TG monsters from the graveyard. Whenever a card says as many as possible, you pretty much have to be afraid of that card. We had cards like that in the past. Like, let's look at Soul Charge and Rekindling, just to give good examples. One of them is already banned, and another one was limited for a good amount of time. So essentially, when you have an effect like those, you pretty much have to keep an eye out for this archetype. This does hard lock you into TGs, similar to the Trident Launcher, but you know, it's kind of fair for you to have that restriction with just how powerful an effect this card is. We have the TG Mighty Striker. Essentially, TG Striker is no longer in the main deck, it's now in the extra deck, and essentially what this one does is it can add you a TG spell or trap from your deck to your hand. The main ones that we are playing are the TG Close, the TG Close, the All Clear, and the Break Limiter. TG Close is essentially a Manadium Reframing or Infinity Barrier. Essentially, it can negate anything as long as you control a machine TG monster. Again, this goes back to All Clear, making all the TG monsters machine. And if a synchro monster is banished, you can reset this card, so it's just really good value like in this synchro strategy. So now that you know about the TG cards, and now that you know about their existence and the plethora of things that you want to be doing with this deck, I'm going to be showing you like a combo. If you see this hand, you'll see that the only TG that we opened is the Gear Zombie. But if you like learned anything from the Sinful Spoils video, you'll essentially see like the importance of like why this engine is so important. Now you see that we have access to the Rocket Salamander, and the Rocket Salamander by itself, if you have it normal summoned, is really strong. Like, we're going to do the Salamanders. The Salamander is going to bring the Screw Serpent. The Screw Serpent can special the TG back from the graveyard, so you can bring back the Salamander, and now you have a synchro play. But we also have the Gear Zombie, which is essentially an extender. We're going to summon the Gear Zombie, and now we're going to summon the Mighty Striker. Mighty Striker is going to grab us the All Clear, and now what essentially we're going to do is to do an All Clear effect. Basically, All Clear is going to pop the Mighty Striker and grab us another TG monster from our deck. And also, another thing to note is this also gives us an extra normal summon for a TG monster. So, like, overall, this card is really strong. If it resolves, let's keep going. We're grabbing the Tank Grub. We're going to mill with the TG Striker, because this does have a graveyard effect. If it's sent to the graveyard, basically you send another TG to your graveyard. We'll be sending the Booster Raptor. That's going to play a role very soon. Now you see that there are two tuners on the field. TG Tank Grub has the effect that if it's going to be used for a synchro for a TG specifically, it can be used as a non-tuner. So that detail is very important. Now what we're going to do is we're going to activate Overdragnar, and we're also going to activate the Tank Grub. Tank Grub is going to give us a token, and the Dragnar is going to bring back essentially everything back from the graveyard. So now we have the token, and now we have all the TG monsters back. And now we're just going to keep synchro climbing. Now we're going to summon the Star Guardian. Star Guardian is going to grab us the Booster Raptor back from the graveyard. We still have our normal summon, and the Booster Raptor itself can also be special summoned. Adding to that, since we have a machine, since all the monsters are now machine because of Outclear's effect, we can now use Rocket Salamander's effect, and it can bring back a TG from the graveyard. Another thing that we can do is we have the Trident Launcher. Like, after the Over Dragnar resolves, like, there's pretty much a lot of different things you can do. This is just one example of plays that you can do. With the Trident, we can just bring back from the graveyard, summon from the hand, and just summon from the deck. Essentially, we're summoning another monster. We're drawing because of Hyper Librarian. We're going to be synchroing again, and this is the new card that I forgot to put in, which is the Glaive Blaster. Let's read it together. If this card must be synchro summoned. If it as a quick effect, you can target a monster that special summon from the extra deck and banish it. So essentially, this is just removal, and it is a quick effect. It can be used up to the number of non-tuner synchro monsters used as a material for this card. This card essentially used 2 monsters as material, so at the moment it can be used 2 times. Adding to that, during the end phase, if a synchro monster is banished, you can, or if a monster is banished face up, you can target one of them and special summon to your field, ignoring the summoning conditions. So that's just like one of the main plays you can be doing with this deck. You can also play like the old Halberd Cannon as well. I'm going to go back and just show you another example of stuff that you can do. Let's say, for example, we didn't synchro into Power Gladiator, we synchroed into a Star Guardian. Let's see if you guys can notice it. I'm going to give you like a couple of seconds. If you haven't figured it out by now, you can Accel synchro on your opponent's turn into the Mighty Strike with the Mighty Striker, and you have 2 tuners and a synchro dragon dark monster. And what does that do? It can summon this card, the Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity. I don't think I need to talk about this card. I don't think I need to introduce what this deck is doing. Essentially, this is another thing that you can be doing in this deck, and it's kind of strong, and essentially you're getting another draw as well. So this is one of the main purposes of this video. I kind of want to show you like the level of things that this TG deck can do. I think TG is just very, very, very powerful as a strategy. I think if you're not careful and you don't know about these cards, you will get Calamity locked, like you just saw. This deck is super aggressive at what it does. The deck is weak to hand traps. That's why you see the cross out and you see the Call by the Grave in the main deck, as well as the 2 talent cards. The Dragnar is a choke point in this deck, so that is a very important note. The TG Close is a really, really strong card. You play this, you play Dark Ruler because you can play this deck going second and just try to break through boards. As you can see, you do have room for non-engine, so basically there are essentially like a couple of hand traps right here. Also, Nibiru really, really hurts this deck, so that's another reason you see it alongside Crossout. But yeah, this was pretty much an introduction to TG. I hope you found this very, very informative. I hope you found this to your liking. More Age of Overlord videos coming soon. Stay tuned and keep practicing and keep dueling.